Earlier this week, someone sent me a video of a woman playing the piano with EEG electrodes on her head. And as she played, different areas of her brain lit up. Pretty cool, right? Except I happened to be rereading The Brain from the Inside Out by György Buzsáki at the time. And Buzsáki warns us about thinking of the brain as a bunch of little boxes. In fact, he compares it to modern-day phrenology. So, what exactly are we looking at when we watch those parts of the brain light up? Stay tuned for the answer. Hi, I'm Becky from Music is Academic, and I work with teachers, schools, families, and organizations to turn brain science into practical tools that support learning, attention, and regulation. Now, back to those little boxes. For a long time, one of the easiest ways to explain the brain has been to divide it up according to what different areas supposedly do. We have a language area, there's the memory area, a movement area, the vision area. You've probably seen those colorful diagrams where every section of the brain seems to come with its own neat little job description. We've done the same thing with the two hemispheres of the brain. How many times have you heard that someone is left-brained because they're logical or good at math, while someone else is right-brained because they're creative or musical? There are certainly differences between the two hemispheres, but some functions do show lateralization. But that is a very different thing from having a logical half of your brain and a creative half. Most of what we do depends on communication across both sides and across many different neural systems. And to be fair, there is some truth behind all these divisions. Different areas of the brain do indeed have different structures, connections, and specialities. Damage to a particular area can absolutely affect a particular ability. The problem comes when we start treating those areas as though they work independently, because your brain doesn't really do anything that neatly. Think about the lady in the video playing the piano. She was moving her fingers, listening to sound, remembering what comes next, reading music or recalling it from memory, adjusting when something doesn't sound right, keeping track of the timing, and predicting what is about to happen, all at once. So when we see one part of the brain light up and say, aha, that part is doing the job, we may be missing much more. The brain isn't a collection of departments working down the hall from one another. It's an incredibly interconnected system, and what those parts are doing together may matter far more than which little box happens to be lighting up at that moment. This brings us back to Buzsáki's rather startling comparison to phrenology. If you remember phrenology from an anatomy or history class, it was the 19th century idea that you could learn about a person's abilities and personalities by examining the shape of their skull. Different sections were assigned different traits, and apparently, if you wanted to know whether someone was cautious, musical, ambitious, or particularly good at something, there was supposedly a bump on the head just for that. We know now, of course, that phrenology was not neuroscience. So Buzsáki isn't suggesting that today's brain researchers are simply repeating 19th century pseudoscience. His criticism is more subtle than that. He's questioning the habit of starting with a behavior we can see or observe, such as memory, language, attention, music, and then searching the brain for the place responsible for it. Once we find activity that seems to correspond with that behavior, it becomes very tempting to give that brain area a label. And this is where those beautiful brain images can get us into trouble. When we see a bright spot appear when someone is speaking or solving a problem or listening to music or playing the piano, it feels like we're watching that ability happen inside the brain. But what we're actually seeing is a measurement associated with one piece of a much larger process. Buzsáki asks us to turn it around. Instead of where in the brain does that behavior happen, we need to begin with the activity already happening inside the brain and ask how those internal patterns give rise to what we eventually see as thought, perception, movement, and behavior. That change may sound small, but it changes the way we look at that pianist with the electrodes on her head. So, what does it actually mean to look at the brain from the inside out? One of Buzsáki's central arguments is that the brain isn't sitting quietly, waiting for something in the outside world to just switch it on. It is constantly active, generating patterns of its own. What we see, hear, feel, and do interacts with activity that is already underway. The pianist gives us a wonderful example. Before she presses the next key, her brain isn't waiting for that sound to arrive and then deciding what to do with it. She is anticipating what comes next. Her movements are being prepared, the sequence is unfolding, and her brain is continuously comparing what she expects to happen with what actually happens. If she hits a wrong note, she knows it almost immediately, not because a little wrong note section of her brain suddenly switches on, but because what happened didn't match what was expected. And this is where timing becomes especially important. Playing music requires events to be organized, not only by what happens, but by when they happen. A perfectly correct note played at the wrong moment is still a wrong note. The nervous system has to coordinate information and action across different time scales so that perception, prediction, movement, and feedback all stay aligned. That gives us a very different picture of what is happening underneath that piano player's electrodes. Instead of asking which part of her brain is playing the piano, perhaps the more interesting thing to ask is how is her brain organizing all of this activity in time well enough for music to emerge? And that question takes us straight into rhythm. And when I say rhythm, I don't just mean the beat of the music. Rhythm is built into the way the brain organizes activity. Neural activity rises and falls across different timescales, and those patterns help coordinate when information is received, when information is directed, and when movement occurs, and what the brain expects to have happen next. That makes music really interesting because music also unfolds through time. A melody only makes sense because one note follows another. A rhythm depends on the relationship between sounds and silences. Even a familiar song depends on your brain remembering what just happened while anticipating what should come next. So, when our pianist sits down at the keyboard, there are really two kinds of timing involved in the conversation. There is the timing we can hear in the music, and there is the ongoing temporal activity of the nervous system that allows her to perceive, predict, coordinate, and respond to it. This is one of the reasons I think we sell rhythm short when we treat it simply as a musical skill. Keeping a beat is useful, of course, but rhythm gives us a way to think about something much larger, how the brain coordinates activity over time. And once we begin looking at the brain that way, those colorful pictures take on a different meaning. Instead of focusing on which part lit up, we can instead wonder what are all the systems doing together and how are they staying in time. So why does any of this matter outside of a neuroscience lab? Because the way we think about the brain affects the way we think about learning. If we imagine separate systems with separate jobs, it becomes easy to think about learning the same way. We teach a skill, look for an outcome, and assume there is a fairly straightforward line connecting the two. But learning rarely happens in isolation. Attention, movement, sensory information, prior experience, prediction, emotion, and memory are all continuously influencing one another. For educators and parents, that shifts from how do I teach this particular skill to something much broader. Instead, what does the brain need in order to be ready to use that skill? Sometimes that means giving a child a predictable pattern before introducing something new. Sometimes it means movement before asking for sustained attention or using a familiar song to help organize a transition. It can be as simple as recognizing that what looks like a problem with one specific skill may actually involve several processes that aren't coordinating particularly well at that moment. And I think there is something really encouraging about that. We don't need to memorize a diagram of the brain or know which colored section supposedly handles which job. What matters much more in everyday life is understanding that learning emerges from a dynamic, coordinated system. That pianist wasn't impressive because we could watch parts of her brain light up. She was impressive because somehow billions of neurons were coordinating perception, memory, prediction, movement, and timing well enough for her to sit down at a piano and make music. And that is far more fascinating than a bunch of little boxes. So the next time you see one of those colorful brain images or a video showing different areas lighting up, enjoy it. I certainly do. They can give us fascinating information about what is happening in the brain. But just remember that the bright spots aren't the whole story. And I'm curious, were you ever taught the left brain, right brain idea? Have you seen one of those brain diagrams that assigns different jobs to every section? Please let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear what you were taught about how the brain works. And if you enjoy looking at music, rhythm, learning, and the brain from a slightly different angle, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to hit the bell so you don't miss a video. Because the more we learn about the brain, the harder it becomes to put it into little boxes. We'll see you next time. Take care.